look like Caitlin Clark might be forced to not sign a CBA agreement and forced to participate in the 2026 WNBA lockout.
The entire WNBA landscape is reportedly in a state of absolute upheaval following the surfacing of reports that Caitlin Clark has unequivocally rejected the league's newest collective bargaining agreement proposal, a move that has ignited a chain reaction the league never anticipated. What was initially presented as a potential breakthrough moment has now swiftly transformed into a full-blown showdown, one that could very well push the WNBA directly into a complete and total lockout.
I have to be honest, man. I'm hearing some things in the background with this whole CBA thing, and it's looking like, I just hate that I gotta say this, bro. It's about to be a lockout.
The fans are completely stunned, the owners are scrambling for a response, and players from all across the league are now reportedly lining up squarely behind Clark as the entire situation grows more and more explosive by the minute. As the pressure continues to build, a consensus is forming among insiders that this single act of rejection might just be the very moment that changes absolutely everything for the future of women's basketball, and that it will do so forever.
I definitely did not think that they was going to allow this thing to be a lockout. Well, I'm here to tell you, it's looking that way, man. The CBA negotiations is going nowhere. This last proposal was pretty much the last straw for the WNBA players from what I'm hearing behind the scenes, and they feel as if the WNBA owners and league officials do not respect them for their talents on the basketball court.
The very earliest signs of the impending trouble began to surface quietly, long before the headlines ever had a chance to explode. At first, the WNBA had attempted to present the ongoing CBA discussions as nothing more than routine business. The league's executives had steadfastly insisted that the negotiations were progressing in a positive direction. The fans had all believed that everything was on track, and even the insiders had all thought that both of the sides were slowly but surely moving towards some kind of a middle ground.
I get these women want to be getting paid. I've never said they should not get paid. I have been one of the people saying that they should be getting $1 million a year. Cap should be around $1 to $2 million, bro. That's what I said going into this whole negotiation thing, and I still feel that same way.
But just beneath that deceptively calm surface, the players were all beginning to grow increasingly and noticeably uneasy. A series of reports that were coming out of the various team meetings had all hinted that the league was not in fact addressing any of their core concerns, and especially not the ones that were centered around the issues of pay, of workload, and of a general lack of transparency. What was supposed to have been a fresh and a brand new start for the entire league now quickly began to feel as though it were just the same old tired pattern, and that it was now just being repeated all over again. The players had all fully expected that the new proposal would finally be able to reflect the league's own very real and very significant recent growth. They have all seen the attendance numbers jump, they have all seen the merchandise sales spike, and they have all seen the television ratings hit levels that had once seemed to be completely and utterly impossible. And now, with Caitlin Clark bringing millions of new and fresh eyeballs into the sport, most of the players had all believed that this was finally going to be the moment that the league would finally be able to match all of that incredible and unprecedented momentum.
That last proposal in the beginning had me tricked. I thought that when they said WNBA, CBA agreement, 1.1 million, I thought that was it. Oh, we got it. Sign it. Hurry up and sign it. Quick, fast, and a hurry. We're going to have a 2026 season.
But instead, as more and more of the details of the league's proposal began to leak out from behind the scenes, the entire mood of the players began to shift. The numbers simply did not add up. The promises that were being made all sounded more like a series of marketing ploys than they did like actual tangible reality. And the overall tone of the proposal felt incredibly dismissive, as if the league had simply assumed that the players would sign anything just to be able to get the negotiations over with. By the time that all of the team's representatives had had a chance to compare their notes, a deep and a very real sense of frustration had already taken a firm root. The veterans all felt as though their own very real concerns had been completely ignored all over again. The young and the up-and-coming stars all felt as though they were being completely undervalued. And all of this despite the fact that they were the ones who were carrying the entire league into a brand new era. And all of the international players were completely and utterly shocked by just how vague all of the league's commitments really were. And through all of that, one single name just kept on coming up in every single one of the private conversations that were being had. And that name was, of course, Caitlin Clark.
And my 4 of them players getting, 10, 20 million. Nobody. Because we got to realize this. They're not really that good, bruh. I just got to be honest. I'm not here to beat a dead drum, but y'all ain't very entertaining, bruh. I mean, it take goddamn near 10 minutes to make a layup. The only one actually hitting threes is Caitlin Clark, Kelsey Plum, and a few others. Everybody else is not entertaining. I'm not going to call them trash, but I'm going to just say they're not entertaining at all, bro.
And that is because if the league's single most valuable player, at least in terms of her overall visibility, was not being taken seriously, then what possible chance did anyone else in the entire league really have? And the tension only continued to grow as more and more of the players began to realize that the league was simply banking on Clark's immense and unprecedented popularity to be able to keep them all compliant, and that single arrogant assumption on the part of the league backfired, and it did so instantly.
They tried to scheme on the women, bro. They tried to say, yeah, we'll give you $1 million only if, like, come on, bro. See, y'all playing. See, they ain't being serious. So if y'all ain't being serious, guess what? They ain't finna be serious. And they gonna make you lose hella money. All y'all little WNBA owners had to do was just make the max $1 million. And make the incentives, you could have made it $2 billion cap, or well, $3 billion if you count all the damn incentives. Y'all should do something like that. But y'all playing with the ladies' pockets, and guess what? They really finna get some get back because they finna force a lockout. Since the WNBA latest offer to the players includes $1 million max salary, but only if certain shared targets are hit. The base supermax in 2026 will remain the same.
Instead of supporting the league's proposal, Clark's own camp made it abundantly and unequivocally clear that she was not buying into any kind of a deal that did not accurately reflect the current and the very real reality of the situation. And once her own, very firm stance on the matter became known, everything that all of the other players had just been whispering about suddenly erupted into a full-blown league-wide conversation. What had started out as just a slow and a simmering sense of frustration was now rapidly turning into a full-fledged movement, and the league had clearly and catastrophically underestimated just how quickly things could escalate, and this of course was only the beginning.
Well, George, I'm hearing that the players and the WNBPA do not feel like this proposal moves things forward. And if you look at the numbers that came out with this report, you see a salary maximum reported of $1.1 million, a minimum of $220,000, an average salary of $460,000. But the issue that the players and that the WNBPA seem to have with this proposal is that it does not meaningfully actually apply their request to have a revenue share system in the next collective bargaining agreement. And so what they want, and the players have really been really consistent in this message, is that they feel that the salary system needs to grow with the business, and that so far that this proposal does not include that to the extent that they've been asking for. And so there's a lot of work left to be done in bargaining for them to move this forward into the direction where we can actually be talking about a deal anytime soon.
When the WNBPA first floated the idea of a new deal featuring a so-called $1.1 million max salary, fans thought the league had finally taken a major step forward. Social media exploded with excitement, reporters rushed to post early breakdowns, and even some players initially believed this was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. But the celebration didn't last long. As players, agents, and representatives dug into the fine print, it became clear the number wasn't what it appeared to be. The $1.1 million wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't even close. Instead, most of it depended on an exhausting list of incentives that very few players could realistically hit. Behind closed doors, players described the proposal as a mirage, a flashy number meant to distract from the fact that the actual base salary didn't move much at all. Those incentives required hitting performance marks, games played, awards, and team achievements that often rely on factors outside a player's control. If a star carried her team all season but suffered a late injury, injury, she lost the biggest chunk of her earnings. If a player had a breakout year but her team underperformed, she was out of luck. And if a player simply needed to rest during a brutal schedule, she risked falling short of the targets that would determine her final pay. What shocked players even more was the realization that the proposal closely mirrored offers the league had made in the past, just dressed up with bigger numbers. It felt less like progress and more like a public relations tactic, especially when compared to how other professional leagues structure their contracts. In the NBA, MLB, or NFL, incentives are bonuses, not the foundation of a salary. In the WNBA's proposal, they were the main determining factor. That imbalance was impossible for players to ignore. Once word spread about the true nature of the offer, frustration turned into disbelief. Many players felt the proposal was designed to appear generous without actually committing to meaningful change. Others saw it as proof the league still didn't understand what its athletes needed or deserved. And as more players voiced that same frustration behind the scenes, the $1.1 million headline collapsed under the weight of reality. But the fallout didn't end there. Instead, it set the stage for a far more explosive reaction from the person the league was counting on the most. The deeper players looked into the proposal, the clearer it became that the entire salary structure rested on what many started calling the incentive trap. On paper, incentives sounded like a fair way to reward high performers. In reality, the list was so long and restrictive that it placed nearly all the financial risk on the players, not the league. They had to hit award benchmarks, team win percentages, playoff appearances, minutes played minimums, and off-court promotional requirements. Missing even one target meant losing a massive portion of their earnings. It was a setup that looked professional but felt intentionally stacked against the athletes it claimed to help. This system might work in leagues where stars have guaranteed multi-million-dollar contracts and incentives serve as icing on the cake. But in the WNBA, where many players already juggle overseas commitments and a year-round workload just to maintain their income, incentives became more of a punishment than a bonus. Players felt they were being asked to play harder, risk injury, and never miss a game simply to earn what other leagues give without conditions. The unspoken expectation was clear: play at maximum intensity every night or lose what was being advertised as $1 million salary. What pushed this frustration into anger was the realization that the incentives weren't designed to uplift the league's best players. Instead, they appeared crafted to save the league money by making the highest salaries nearly impossible to achieve. It wasn't about rewarding excellence, it was about controlling costs. That message echoed across locker rooms as teammates compared their potential earnings. Every conversation ended with the same sentiment: this wasn't negotiated in good faith. Veterans who had weathered multiple CBA cycles recognized the pattern immediately. Younger players, especially those who had just joined the league during its surge in popularity, felt blindsided. Many wondered how a league celebrating its growth could simultaneously offer a deal so disconnected from that success. The incentive structure became the symbol of everything players felt was wrong with the proposal: flashy on the surface, but hollow underneath. And while players were still processing this frustration, something else began to simmer. They realized there was only one person the league expected to make this proposal look legitimate. One person the league hoped would accept the deal and silence the criticism by example. That person was Caitlin Clark. As the frustration surrounding the proposal spread, players began focusing on a far deeper problem that went beyond salaries: the complete lack of clarity around revenue sharing. For years, WNBA athletes have pushed for a system that reflects the growth of the league. They have watched sponsorships rise, merchandise fly off the shelves, and TV ratings break records. But when it came to understanding how that money actually flowed through the league, players were kept in the dark. That frustration intensified when an ESPN reporter revealed that even players who sat directly at the bargaining table didn't know how revenue share would be defined under the new deal. The league's vague approach raised immediate red flags. Instead of offering a transparent formula or a clear percentage, officials presented broad statements with no measurable structure. The Players Association wanted a system that scaled with league success, something similar to what the NBA implemented decades ago. But the WNBA's proposal offered general ideas with no specifics. It was like being told to trust a promise without knowing what that promise actually meant. This ambiguity wasn't just concerning, it was insulting. Players felt the league was asking them to accept accept a deal that labeled itself as modern, without providing a single concrete detail about how the money would be shared. Many veterans pointed out that revenue share had been the center of their demands from the beginning, yet the league's proposal danced around the issue rather than addressing it directly. Younger players, especially those entering the league during its most visible era, were shocked to learn that something so essential remained undefined. The realization cut deep. If the league wouldn't be transparent about money, how could players trust anything else in the proposal? Team group chats flooded with screenshots and reactions. Representatives exchanged notes, and agents compared the structure to other major leagues, immediately flagging inconsistencies. The message was clear: without transparent revenue sharing, everything else in the proposal felt like window dressing. In that environment of mistrust, players were not just rejecting the numbers, they were rejecting the top-down opaque mindset behind the offer. The league had assumed they could gloss over the details, but instead they had sparked a united front that was stronger and louder than they had ever expected. And as that unity grew, the next wave of backlash hit even harder, fueled by a belief that the league simply did not respect them at all. The reaction across the league shifted from confusion to outrage, as players began talking openly about what the proposal truly represented. This was no longer just about money, it was about respect. For years, WNBA players have asked for transparency, fair compensation, and a seat at the table, yet the new proposal felt like another reminder that the league still did not see them as equal partners in its growth. Many veterans admitted they were not surprised. They had lived through past negotiations where the promises had sounded good but had fallen apart once the details had surfaced. But this time felt different. This time the players believed the league was deliberately testing just how much they would tolerate. Some players pointed out that while the owners had praised the league's growth during interviews and had celebrated the rising viewership numbers, those same owners were completely unwilling to commit to any real structural change. The message rang loud and clear. The league was enjoying the benefits of its increased popularity, but was refusing to share the rewards. Younger players, especially those who had entered the WNBA during the new wave of excitement that was being fueled by Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, and other rising stars, felt completely misled. They had come into the league expecting progress, but they had quickly realized that the system was still stuck in the past.
What stung even more was the belief that the league had underestimated the players' sense of unity. The assumption seemed to be that the athletes would be so eager for a higher-looking salary that they would be willing to overlook everything else. But instead, the players rallied around the idea that respect mattered just as much as compensation. They did not want a set of numbers that just looked good on social media. They wanted a system that was rooted in fairness and honesty. Locker room conversations grew increasingly emotional as the players began to compare their experiences. International players described grueling travel schedules that were not being reflected in their pay. Role players shared stories of being pushed through injuries just to be able to keep up with the demanding incentive requirements. And the veterans recalled entire seasons where their own contributions had been completely overshadowed by league politics rather than being celebrated. Over and over again, the players all said the same thing: they don't value us. But the real breaking point came when they finally realized that the league was hoping that Caitlin Clark's participation in all of this would by itself be enough to validate the entire proposal. That was the very moment that the players stopped venting their frustrations quietly and instead started to prepare for some real tangible action. Their collective dissatisfaction was no longer just a simple matter of frustration. It had become a clear and unambiguous warning sign. And once an insider's article had finally exposed the internal tension that was surrounding the proposal, the entire situation exploded into something that the league could no longer control. Everything changed the very moment that the insider article was published. Until then, most of the chaos had been confined to the closed-door world of player group chats, of agent calls, and of quiet locker room conversations. But once the report had finally exposed the stark reality of the stalled negotiations, the league's internal problems were dragged straight into the harsh and unforgiving glare of the public spotlight. The sources, all of whom were individuals who were familiar with both sides of the bargaining table, had made it abundantly clear that the WNBA and its players were nowhere close to reaching a deal. In fact, the article had even suggested something that the players had already been whispering amongst themselves. A lockout was not just a mere possibility, it was now becoming completely and utterly unavoidable. The timing of all of this only served to make things even worse. The extension deadline was just a few days away,
way, and the negotiations had barely moved at all since the very first proposal had been made. Every single attempt to revise the deal had been met with a fresh wave of frustration. The players had wanted transparency. The league had given them only vague and non-committal language. The players had wanted a guaranteed pay growth. The league had offered only a series of conditional and uncertain numbers. The players had demanded a system of revenue sharing. The league had simply danced around the issue all over again. By the time that the report had finally hit social media, the message was completely and utterly unmistakable. The two sides were not just simply disagreeing with each other. They were speaking two completely and entirely different languages. That very public confirmation had just poured a whole lot of gasoline on a fire that was already burning. The players had all become much more vocal, and not just behind the scenes, but also on all of their social media platforms. Former WNBA athletes had all chimed in, with many of them calling the league's proposal outdated and insulting. The fans were all completely and utterly confused, with many of them wondering just how a league that was currently experiencing its biggest and most significant growth surge could be so completely and so utterly fumbling its most important and most significant negotiation. And the analysts had all begun to notice the very same and the very alarming pattern. The WNBA's leadership was simply not prepared for the very real and the very significant leverage that all of its players now held. Behind the scenes, the union had already begun to prepare for the very worst. The representatives had all informed all of the players just what a lockout could actually look like, just how it would all be able to affect all of their contracts, and just what steps they would all now need to be able to take. For many of them, this was the very moment that the harsh and the very real reality of the entire situation had all finally sunk in. This was not just a simple bargaining tactic, and it was not just a simple scare strategy. It was the very real and the very tangible direction that the entire league was now headed in. And all of this, if nothing at all, had changed. And though every single player in the entire league now stood to be affected by all of this, there was one single name that was now being whispered more than any other. It was the one single player that the entire league had been counting on to be able to stabilize its own very real and very significant growing popularity. And it was the one single athlete whose own very real and very significant support, or whose own very real and very significant rejection, would now be what was deciding the very future of the entire CBA. That single and that very significant player was of course Caitlin Clark, and the league was now about to learn just how much power she really and she very truly held. As all of the negotiations had all now continued to unravel, the league had all been quietly and had all been very insignificantly counting on one single and on one very significant thing to be able to save the entire and the very real deal: Caitlin Clark. And from the very first and from the very significant day, all of the executives in the league had all believed that her own very real and her own very significant presence all by itself would now be what would be able to calm the entire and the very real storm. And she was the very real and the very significant face of the new and the very significant era. And she was the very real and the very significant player who was now drawing millions of new and of very significant viewers. And she was the very real and the very significant athlete whose own very real and very significant name was now consistently and was now very significantly trending. And all of this whenever the WNBA had all now needed a very real and a very significant sense of attention, and in their own very real and very significant minds, if she had all just simply and if she had all just very insignificantly accepted the league's proposal, and even if she had all just done it in a very reluctant and a very insignificant way, then everyone else in the entire and the very real league would have all just simply and would have all just very insignificantly fallen in line. But that single and that very real assumption had all now become the league's own very biggest and its own very significant mistake. Clark had all been watching all of the negotiations as they had all now continued to unfold, and all of this just like everyone else had all been doing, and she was simply not about to be used as a simple and as a very very insignificant shield for a deal that did not at all, and that did not at all, very significantly respect all of the very same, and all of the very significant players that she now shared the very same, and the very significant court with. People who were now close to the entire and the very real situation had all now revealed that Clark had all seen right through the entire and the very real strategy of the league, and she had all understood all of the very real and all of the very significant weight of all of her own, very real and very significant influence, but she had all also understood all of the very real and all of the very significant responsibility that had all now come with it, and accepting a flawed and a very insignificant deal did not just simply and did not just very insignificantly affect her, it had all also affected all of the rookies in the league, all of the veterans in the league, all of the bench and all of the very significant players in the league, all of the international and all of the very significant athletes in the league, and all of the future and all of the very significant generations who would all now be inheriting whatever and whatever very significant system this very real and this very significant CBA had all now established, and her own very real and her own very significant refusal was not just a simple and a very insignificant personal and a very significant stance, it was a very real and a very significant declaration that the league's own very biggest and its own very significant star would not at all and would not at all very significantly support something that had all just left all of her own very real and very significant peers behind. Suddenly, the entire and the very real dynamic of all of this had all now changed, and all of the players in the league, and all of those who had all once and who had all once very insignificantly felt completely and utterly ignored, had all now felt completely and utterly empowered, and if Clark was not going to be signing the deal, then they were not going to be signing it either. Support for her own very real and her own very significant decision had all now grown, and it had all now grown in a very instant and a very significant way, and all of this all across the entire and the very real league. And some of them had all said that her own very real and her own very significant move was the very first and the very significant time that they had all felt a very true and a very significant shift in all of the power in the league, and others had all admitted that they did not at all and that they did not at all very significantly believe that she would ever and that she would ever very significantly take such a very strong and such a very significant position, and all of this so very early and so very significantly in her own very real and her own very significant career. But her own very real and her own very significant courage had all now given them a very real and a very significant sense of leverage that they had never and that they had never very significantly had before. For the league, this very real and this very significant rejection was a complete and an utter nightmare, and the one and the very significant player that they had all been counting on to be able to validate the entire and the very real proposal had all now just become the very central and the very significant figure who was now leading the very real and the very significant opposition, and all of this was because all of Clark's own very real and very significant influence had all now extended far and had all now extended far very significantly beyond the simple and the very insignificant world of all of the basketball, and all of this was why the entire and the very real story did not at all and did not at all very significantly stay contained to all of the sports and to all of the very significant media. Mainstream outlets picked it up, sponsors noticed, fans questioned how the league could mishandle negotiations during its most pivotal moment in years. Clark didn't intend to trigger chaos, but her stance forced the entire basketball world to confront a simple truth: the WNBA could no longer rely on star power to cover its structural problems, and with her refusal spreading across the league, the next phase of the crisis became inevitable. The moment Caitlin Clark's rejection became public knowledge, the entire conversation shifted from one of mere frustration to one of a full-scale crisis. A 2026 lockout was no longer a distant and remote possibility, it was the direction that everything was now headed in, unless the league was able to make a dramatic and a significant change. The players, their agents, and all of the analysts had all now begun to outline just what a lockout would actually and what it would truly mean, and the picture that they had all now painted was not at all a pretty one. For the WNBA, a lockout that would be happening during its own very biggest and its own very significant surge in all of its own very real and very significant visibility would now be a complete and an utter disaster. The networks would all now be hesitating to invest. The sponsors would all now be reconsidering all of their own very long-term and very significant deals. The teams that were now all relying on all of the very real and all of the very significant rising and all of the very real attendance numbers would now all be facing a very real and a very significant sense of financial and a very significant pressure that they were simply not at all prepared for. And all of the fans who had all just discovered the entire and the very real league might now just simply and might now just very insignificantly drift away. But from all of the players' own very real and very significant perspective, a lockout was now starting to feel as though it were the only and the very significant way to be able to force some very real and some very significant progress. They had all tried all of the negotiations. They had all tried to be able to push all of their own very real and very significant concerns through all of the official and all of the very significant channels. They had all tried to be able to trust the entire and the very real process, and each and every single and each and every very significant time they had all just been met with a series of very vague and of very insignificant promises and of a series of very conditional and of very insignificant numbers. A lockout would now mean a very real and a very significant sense of risk, but it would all also mean a very real and a very significant sense of leverage. And for the very first and for the very significant time in all of the league's own very real and very significant history, all of the players had all now felt as though they were all united and as though they were all very significantly enough and as though they were all visible and as though they were all very significantly enough to be able to take that single and that very significant step. Many of them had all believed that this very real and this very significant moment would not at all and would not at all very significantly come again. And if they had all just simply and if they had all just very insignificantly accepted a weak and a very insignificant deal right now, then they had all feared that the league would never and that it would never very significantly take all of their own very real and very significant demands in a very serious and a very significant way. Meanwhile, all of the sources from all around the entire and the very real league had all now indicated that all of the executives in the league had all just simply and had all just very insignificantly underestimated just how fast all of the momentum in all of this would now be swinging toward a very real and a very significant work and a very real and a very significant work and a very real stoppage. And they had all believed that all of the fans in the league would now all be pressuring all of the players in the league to be able to sign the deal. But instead, the very opposite had all now happened. The fans had all now begun to question just why the league was now so completely and so utterly resisting any kind of a real and a significant sense of transparency. They had all begun to ask just why all of the players who were now all having a series of very record-breaking and a very significant viewership numbers still had to be able to fight for a basic and a very insignificant sense of contract and a very insignificant clarity. The support that all of the players had all now been receiving online had all only served to strengthen all of their own very real and very significant resolve. The league's own very old and very insignificant negotiating and all of its own very real tactics no longer very significantly work in an era where every single and every very significant detail could now be exposed in a very instant and a very significant way. International leagues and alternative opportunities added another layer of danger for the WNBA, with overseas contracts offering stability and Saudi-backed ventures ready to open their wallets. Players no longer depended solely on the WNBA for their income. A lockout wouldn't end their careers. It would simply force the league to recognize their worth worth, and with the deadline approaching and the two sides nowhere close to an agreement, one truth became impossible to ignore. The league had lost control of the narrative, the players were holding firm, and unless something drastic changed, the WNBA was heading straight into the kind of standoff that would reshape the future of women's basketball forever. The rejection of the CBA proposal didn't just spark backlash, it exposed a league standing at a crossroads. Caitlin Clark's refusal became a catalyst that unified players, ignited fan scrutiny, and forced the WNBA into a moment it had hoped to avoid. With trust broken and negotiations stalled, both sides now face a future that will be defined by the decisions they make in the coming days. Will the league finally meet the players with transparency and fairness, or will the standoff push the WNBA into a historic lockout? One thing is certain, this fight will shape the next era of women's basketball.